This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages.
Welcome to Seismic, a podcast about a fast-changing world.
What is real? How do you define real?
Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
It's about everyone. It's about all of us. It's about potential. It's about possibility.
The singularity is probably the right word because we just don't know what's going to happen.
How dare you!
Hello, Ryan. Thanks for accepting my invitation to join me on this podcast.
That's great to be here. Thank you.
Classic question to start with. Can you please briefly introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Ryan Gellert. I'm based in Amsterdam, and I am the general manager of Patagonia for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. I'm from the U.S., and I have been with Patagonia in this role for about 5.5 years now.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to start with, again, I'd like to understand a little bit more how you see things. You know, what is your worldview as an individual before going into more of the professional side? You know, how do you look at the world today? What do you think is at stake, and what should we, in your opinion, spending more time discussing collectively?
I think that I believe the climate and the ecological crisis, which, I think an important part of this is it's one of our own creation. It's one of our own making, I think should really dominate global conversation and our priorities. And, I'm modestly encouraged by the fact that it, is getting an increasing amount of attention, but pretty discouraged by the fact that it's almost competing. The significance of this and our willingness to engage with it and talk about it and find solutions feels like it's competing with much less important issues, including economic growth. And so, while I believe that this problem, the climate and ecological crisis is vast, and it's exactly the kind of problem that governments were intended to address, it's not working. And so what I really believe is that in addition to governments, businesses and individuals have a role if we're going to have any chance in mitigating the biggest impacts of what we've created.
So, yeah, I guess, and we're going to go through these tough questions. How do you maintain the economy and do business in a world that's where you have energy issues and when you have climate issues? That's one of the big topics that we should be all discussing, and it's very difficult. So I would like to get your point of view on that, and especially starting again with going back to Patagonia. The mission statement of the company is we are in business to save our home planet, right? Doing business, which is basically manufacturing and shipping products or services, all these have an impact, whatever product you make. So in your view, how is it possible actually to run a business while having such a mission of saving the planet? Is it compatible?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I'm going to answer it. So if it sounds like I'm not, just give me a minute, because I think some perspective for sort of who Patagonia is and how we think about this and the evolution over our history, I think is really important than landing at the answer to that question. So I'll speak on that for a minute. We're founded 47 years ago by someone, Yvon Chouinard, who still owns the company today, who, when he founded the company, and largely today as well, has spent as much time as possible in wild places, whether it was climbing, surfing, skiing, or fishing. And there's been these sort of chapters within the 47-year Patagonia history where we have focused on something, and then as we feel like we've made some progress, or conversely, the overall health of the planet is moving in the wrong direction, we continue to add to our commitments. And I think in the early days, the commitment was really around minimizing our impact. So understand the impact that we're having on the planet by running this business and figure out how we minimize it. And then the next phase was, in addition to that, scaling any solutions that we developed or found along the way so that they didn't just exist within the four walls of Patagonia, but they existed more broadly. And then what we came to realize is no matter what we were doing there, we were still having an impact on the planet. And so we started taxing ourselves what we called an earth tax. And that became 1% of revenue every year, whether it was a good year or bad financially. And we have, since the mid-'80s, funneled those funds towards small grassroots organizations working on topics of clean air, clean water, clean soil. And then as we continued to progress through this, building on everything I've just said, we started supporting activists and organizations in a variety of ways, capacity building, community building, amplifying their messages. And then we've started engaging in activism more directly ourselves. And so I think that brings us up to about 18 months ago. And we had a mission statement since the early 90s. It was a bit wordy. I'm not going to repeat it here, but basically focused on making quality product, minimizing our impact on the planet, and then using the business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. And that was a pretty radical, pretty progressive mission statement when we put it in place in the early 90s. And I think Yvonne, in the last couple of years, felt like we had outgrown it and we had gotten too comfortable with it. We had outgrown it. And you combine that with a feeling that I think most of us share, which is the overall health of the planet is not just moving in the wrong direction. It's doing so, in many cases, exponentially faster than scientists and other experts thought possible, even in recent years. And that was really the reason for the new mission statement. And so, in answer to your question, how do you square the circle, as it were, and having this commitment in making goods that, in essence, and I think we're really clear-eyed about this, people don't need. They may want, but they don't need them most of the time. And I think one of the things we believe strongly is the most sustainable jacket or the most sustainable pair of pants that you can buy is one that already exists, not a brand new one. And so what we try to do is focus on really not just having conversations on these topics with our customers and really challenging them not to buy things that they don't need, but also entering relationships with them where we help to ensure that they can keep their product in use as long as possible. And that's product repair, both teaching them how to do it, also running repair facilities. It's eco-engineering within our supply chains. And it's using the business in a variety of ways, our money, our reputation, our people, and otherwise, to prove that businesses can do more than just exist to maximize shareholder wealth. And it's my belief that if you look at the money that Patagonia has given and some of the things that we've championed and so forth, I think the single biggest thing we've accomplished to date is just proving to businesses across industry and different sizes, not that we've been entirely successful with this, but proving and having an impact to some extent that businesses can exist to do more.
So that means potentially, and that means actually limiting how fast you grow. Right.
I think it always has. And I think growth for us has been, I think over the entire 47-year history of Patagonia has been a really uncomfortable topic. And it's one at times we've gotten comfortable with and we've justified to ourselves because we feel that if people are buying, for instance, in our industry, outdoor apparel, if the industry is growing a couple of percent a year and we're growing, say, 10 or 15%, I think what that proves is we're taking market share from others. And if we believe we're taking market share from others who don't apply the same standards, there is something that we can get comfortable with that. But at the same time, what we have to be very honest with ourselves is, hey, what are we doing with the resources of the business, the position that we have, the financial resources, our people, our reputation, and otherwise, and how do we ensure that we can be comfortable with the size of the business that we're building? And I'll just say one other quick thing on that. We're more than $1 billion business globally today. And as we were headed in that direction, but not yet there, Yvonne was incredibly concerned about how big the business was getting. And one of the things that he said quite often as we were moving in that direction was, I've never met a $1 billion business I like or respect, and I sure as hell don't want to own one. And I think that sort of captures the kind of responsibility we've tried to put on ourselves in living up to, the standards that we expect of ourselves.
And you think that could be applied to other companies or to many type of companies? Like, I would like to understand what is very much unique about Patagonia, that make it possible to act this way when most of the companies can't. I guess that you just mentioned it. There's something about the founder, the vision, but is there something else that you want to mention?
It's funny. I end up talking to the leaders of a lot of different businesses, and in essence, the conversations are pretty formulaic. Appreciate what you guys are doing. Would really like to understand it because, candidly, we're taking some steps internally, and perhaps we have for a long time. We don't talk about them very much. We'd like to do more, but I guess my question is how does Patagonia do what it does? Because we'd like to think about doing things similar. And there are some leaders that you talk with who you feel like, hey, this is a really deep commitment. They're serious about this and they're doing the deep thinking required to make this kind of change. But I think the vast majority of them also, often you start unpacking how we think about life and the commitments that we burden ourselves with. And they say, yeah, okay, can you just give me the easy part? That sounds difficult. What's the easy 10%? And, I think our story and our way of thinking about business is pretty simple. We try to lead consistently a very considered life, really understanding what impacts we're having on the planet, be radically honest with ourselves about that and transparent with our communities. We try not to talk about what we intend to do, but instead just communicate steps that we've taken. And I think finally, what we're really relentlessly committed to doing is changing systems, not just, being at the forefront of individual decisions. And I'll give you a story maybe that'll help make the point. In the early 90s, we started to understand the impacts of conventionally grown cotton. And in 1996, since 1996, we've never used any cotton in our product that was not 100% organic. And so it was 24 years ago that we made that commitment. And it almost put us out of business, pivoting as quickly as we did to 100% organic cotton. And at the time we did that, less than 1% of the world's cotton was organically grown. And I would imagine most of your listeners are very familiar with hearing about organic cotton in the apparel sector today. The reality is today, 24 years after we put that commitment in place, less than 1% of the world's cotton is organically grown. And so we can view this story as we were at the forefront, we were very progressive, we led a revolution, or we can look at it really honestly and say we have completely and utterly failed to change the system. And for us, we look at it that second way, and we're constantly asking ourselves, why hasn't this worked, and what else can we do? And I think that mindset is really critical if you're trying to consistently pivot your business towards more sustainable practices and understand there's no finish line in that pursuit.
Well, this is why I like to start, asking the question about the worldview, because and this is what you just said. I guess the secret recipe is to get everyone aligned inside the company about how the world functions. What are the actual issues and what are the actual solutions or not solutions, and that makes it very, very challenging and specific, because I guess it's all about the people that are inside the culture and the set of belief, right?
I think it very much is. And I think one of the great ideas that Yvonne and his team had early on was, we don't want to build a CSR department. We want to build a culture and a philosophy. And that's another piece of advice I often try to share with other business leaders is, that's the harder route, but it's the only one that's really going to have true impact. I think if you have a group of people in the corner of the office that work on CSR topics the same way you do HR people or accounts payable or whatever it is, you're building something that the rest of the employees look at as not my job. And I think that's a huge, huge mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I'm myself into the business of trying to transform companies, right? And I always find it hard because you have to start with this set of belief, and that's probably the most difficult thing to change. But you also have some other type of structural hurdles, that prevent company from really changing. For example, I'm thinking of the rules for accounting practices, right, that are not taking into account the impact that we have on the external environment, right, or the need to report against short-term financial targets, especially if you are in the listed company. What's your take on this? How, for example, a listed company could do what you do? Is that even feasible?
I think it is. And, and perhaps I say that a little bit naively, but I've worked in a publicly traded company, and I believe that often what we have a tendency to do, and I find this a lot in conversations, is find the easy excuse. Really quickly try to zero in on, well, why is it not possible for me to do the hard work? And here's 3 reasons. And the one that I run into the most often is public structure. But let me step back and just say, I think the system, capitalism, needs to evolve if we're going to have a healthy planet. I think the public markets are certainly way too wedded to short-term thinking. And I think we need to measure across industries for the externalities, recognizing that there's really nothing external about air, water, soil, biodiversity, and wildlife. And I think we need to create an environment where business really steps up and takes responsibility for the footprint that it has on the planet and it has on its customers. And I think the customers need to take responsibility for not buying things that they don't need. And then finally, there's certainly a role for government in holding businesses responsible for the damage they do to the planet. But all of that said, so I think that's a real systemic change that needs to take place. I think that, you made the reference to public companies needing to do quarterly reporting. That's absolutely the case. That's the rhythm in which they work. I don't think that there's anything that is a black and white requirement within the need to report quarterly that says you have to show a certain amount of growth or you cannot make investments in managing the footprint of your business. And so again, I recognize that for us, life's a little simpler on these topics. We've got very progressive and absolutely aligned ownership, and that's a really unique position we're in. We are privately held versus publicly traded. The system of capitalism does need to evolve. But all of that said, I would really challenge all of us in all of our walks of life, government, business, individuals, not to look for how quickly we can get to know this isn't possible, but instead to recognize that we've got a responsibility and these things are within our ability to impact.
So you think, basically you say, like, if we don't think this is possible to change it, there is no way we can do it. And it's everyone's responsibility, from the boss of the company to the employee deciding who we will be working for. I'm still wondering, where do you start? Like changing a system like economic capitalism, It looks, and this is why I've been meeting a lot of people saying that this cannot be done. This is beyond us. Like the system is too complex, it's beyond us. So you've got too many forces that goes against, the willingness to change. What do you think of that? What gives you hope in the thing that you just mentioned? Do you see people around you really trying to work on these issues and that shift happening in how the system works?
Yeah, I think that I can point to. I think I can point to a few things that give me confidence. But let me start by saying, these are hard miles, and I think people that are saying it can't be done. Look, we put a couple of men on the moon 50 years ago. We can figure out how to modify our capitalist systems. This is, it's intellectually something. Yeah, it's intellectually within our grasp. So I don't have a lot of patience for people who they'll tell you in their role as business leader that anything's possible and they can do this and they can do that. And then you serve up a tough problem and it's, can't be done. I inherently don't buy that logic. But to be more positive and talk about things, areas where I see some reason for optimism, I look at the B Corp movement, which is a movement that is scaling globally, started in the U.S., is very present across most states in the U.S. and is really gotten root here in Europe. But it's becoming very much an international movement. And that's really a movement to recognize that business has roles, has commitments to not just its owners, but also to the communities in which it operates and to the health of the planet. And I think that all of us within business and beyond can help to scale that movement and ensure that as we scale it, we don't dilute its impact and its commitments, but we continue to push them forward. And you see a lot of businesses across industry and across ownership structures and sizes becoming B Corp. So I think that's really encouraging. I think that there is a real need, and thankfully, I think there's a lot of bright spots on this topic for customers to participate directly in the evolution. I think it's time that we no longer take excuses from business leaders that, it's too hard, it's too difficult. We're not going to move if the whole industry doesn't move. Enough of that. Let's move towards a level of transparency, honesty about what we're doing and how we can do better. And then I think finally, whether business leaders make changes for the right reasons, meaning they're concerned about the health of the planet and their communities, or they do it because we're quickly heading towards a world of less discrete and virgin resources, either way, I think that we're going to have to all future-proof our businesses. And so I think some of the things we do selfishly are for that reason. And I think that, I think that can be a pretty good area to tap into for business leaders to justify the evolution to more circular models and lower impact models.
So it's a kind of a call also for everyone to take its own responsibility and to become an activist. It's in its own way. On this, there is now a big trend, as you just mentioned a little bit about environmentalism and sustainability, is becoming a buzzword very quickly. And all brands are coming up with big plans to become sustainable, and let's do something about the planet, etc. Like big announcements from Microsoft, etc. How do you see this at Patagonia? And is it diluting your positioning, reinforcing it, or is it challenging you to go a little bit further in order to continue to lead the pack, or it's not really related to how you see yourself?
I don't think that we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about what others are doing, particularly in the apparel space, because if I'm honest with you, I don't think there's any big players in the apparel space who are really doing anything super meaningful. I think there's a lot of small companies that are doing fantastic work. I think there's a lot of big companies that are making modest changes and doing a lot to communicate those changes and make them sound like, basically, but for them or with them, climate change is solved and on to the next problem. And I just think that's, I think there's a real desire amongst quite a few to create confusion and obfuscate the issues. But I think in your question, you hit on a couple of key points that I maybe want to unpack for a minute. The first is this idea of sustainability. We've been trying to minimize our footprint on the planet for our entire 47-year history, and it's come in a lot of forms, many of which I described before. The reality is 47 years into this, I don't think any of us believe that we're a truly sustainable company. I think what we feel is, if anything, we're a responsible company and that we really wrestle with these issues. But, I think the definition of sustainability is pretty straightforward, and we don't feel we meet it yet. And so I think that word is overstretched. I think you see a lot of companies and a lot of people intentionally obfuscating the definition of that word and defining themselves as sustainable, which I think is really risky. I think one of the other points that you made in your question was, I think you used the term big plans. And, I think that gets to this notion of people talking about what they intend to do in the future versus just what they're doing today. And, I would just really counsel customers to really think about what they're hearing and ask themselves, does that matter today, or is that just a communication about intent in the future? I don't think anybody's ever gotten fitter by planning to go on a diet. You either do or you don't. And I think that's important. And I think the other thing is often, and I think there's a bit of intent behind this as well with some companies, and that's this notion that, hey, we've made a change here, and here, problem solved. And the reality is anybody that's thinking about these issues knows there's no finish line in the path to minimizing your impact as a business and to finding creative solutions to the problem that collectively all of us as humans have solved. And I think a real dose of humility and understanding the scale of the problem, understanding your responsibilities within them, and this endurance that we're not going to get to a point where this problem, the problem is behind us and we can move on. We move back to business as usual. I don't see that in our future.
I'd like to get your take on leadership in general, because I guess it's very challenging for a lot of businesses, to find what are the good ways of doing things, what are the values at work. And from listening to what you said, I suspect that this is something that you pay a lot of attention at Patagonia, but what is the internal dynamics, that people don't really see and that you would like to talk about? How important this is how did you update, your style of leadership once you started to discover what's at stake and how you want to do things? What's your corporate culture like?
Yeah, I think our corporate culture on leadership is probably as influenced by Yvonne as any dynamic within the business. And I think Yvonne has he's very bold in his thinking. He's very humble. He's got the deepest commitment, arguably of anybody I've met in any walk of life. And I think, as is often the case with organizations, I think a lot of us have, the organization and so many of us in it have both taken inspiration from that, but I think maybe without thinking about it, really tried to emulate that. But, I think looking beyond just Patagonia, and maybe I've hit on some of this in your previous question, but I just find this whole idea of leadership to be a really interesting one. It's funny because I think there are a few titles in life that I think are more flattering than being described as a leader. And I think everybody loves it. And the CEO and executive teams and boards of every major organization, man, there's few things you can call them that are more flattering to them and they like to call themselves than leader. But what I think is really critical to remind ourselves of is leadership isn't what you do in front of a receptive audience or what you say in conversations like the one we're having here. I think leadership is really making tough decisions on issues big and small. And it's not because they make you money or they make you popular, but because you know they're the right thing to do. And so I think to your question before about, hey, a lot of people just throwing their hands up and saying the problems are too big and we can't change the system. We can't reverse or mitigate the biggest impacts of the climate and ecological crisis. Yeah, I'd say that anybody for whom those words are coming out of their mouth, I don't understand how they can be comfortable calling themselves a leader, because I think that really requires stepping up in the face of these challenges and figuring out what we can do starting today, regardless of whether it makes you money in the short term.
Super interesting. I couldn't agree more personally, but it's there's something also in the culture that's one of the biggest challenges we have related to how we define precisely, what's a leader, what's a successful person. I suspect that you haven't been, like everyone, as you discover, you unwrap all these issues, as your worldview evolves. I'm curious to understand how your vision of success also has evolved. To me, that's something that strikes me. Like, until we defined success differently from what we do today, will be very difficult, because you want to rise above, you want to compete, you want to consume, etc. What's your take, your personal take, maybe on this?
I think success, I think there's something that is, cultures are different around the world, but I think there are some universal truths. And I think one of them is that as you get older, I think you narrow your focus to the things that really matter. And I think you gain with wisdom and with years, if you're leading a thoughtful existence, kind of a real deep sense of the things that are most important to you. And I think it's, a well-worn truth that how much money you accumulate is not one of them. And so I think within the role of business specifically, I think success is measured by the impact that you can have. I think it's measured by the respect of the people that you can attain for doing the right things the right way, particularly under adverse conditions, particularly when in the face of really big, complex challenges. I think that I am an American, as I mentioned before. We're probably the worst in the world at sort of celebrating all of the wrong things, which is material success first and foremost. And if, the only thing that might compete with that is influence, power, and fame. And I think that's just so backwards. And I do think that as the health of the planet moves in the direction that it's moving in, I think that these things are going to evolve, because I think they're going to evolve out of necessity. I wish that would happen a whole lot quicker than it seems to.
What would you recommend, like the people in situation of leadership, like the CEOs or the people that have responsibility of at any organization? What should they start doing? Or is it about thinking differently? Is it about spending some time to really analyze the global issues, etc.? And what would it take for them to actually listen and understand and act to what you just said, on what you just said, when you've got so much noise and so much pressure to act quickly? You see the challenge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I think that we're so many of us are stuck in these short-term cycles where you've got to make sure that this quarter is better than the last, and you've got to show progress, and most of that progress is tied pretty directly to economic growth. I think we're all like hamsters running on a wheel to some extent. But to your question, what would I suggest to CEOs and leaders that they focus on? I think that there's a couple of things. I think one is, if you're in the business of making things, so, service industries are a little bit different, I think, in this, but if you make something, as we do, I think the single strongest piece of advice I can give you is to really commit to deeply understanding your supply chain, because I think in almost every business that manufactures anything, I think that's where the dirty stuff happens. And it's not enough to understand just the last touch point where assembly is done, or whatever the equivalent by industry might be, but to really understand the depth of your supply chain. And so for us in the apparel space, that's down to the farm level, if it's natural materials, and that's down at least to the mill level, if not beyond, in synthetic materials. I think the other piece of advice that I would have is, again, going back to that analogy I shared before about a lot of business leaders coming in and saying, hey, we'd like to sort of put our head above ground, but we're a little nervous it's going to get blown off if we make statements about our ambitions and sustainability. So what do you suggest? Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't have the answer for everybody, but the thing that I often come back to is, number one piece of advice I'd give you is do some deep thinking about what you really are committed to. And in that, do some deep thinking about what you're willing to risk or invest to further that issue. And then the second piece of advice I would give you is exactly the same. Do some deep thinking on what you're really committed to and what you're willing to do about it. Because I think if you can emerge with a deep sense of self, this is why we exist, this is what we believe, and we're going to champion these issues, I think not only will that will provide clarity, but what it will also do is give you a level of healthy self-confidence in weathering some of the tough conversations internally and externally that are almost certainly going to follow.
You mentioned that you were a B Corp. How do you see B Corp being a nice playbook, to tackle all these topics? Do you think it's a system, and maybe you've got other systems out there that are really connecting the dots? Because I guess also one of the things that you mentioned is that you cannot do A without doing B. Like you cannot really change deeply your company without working on yourself and becoming a little bit, changing your worldview and becoming wiser about these topics. And B Corp is, in my opinion, doing a good job at laying down, all the different dots there are to connect. Like, is it a good playbook that you recommend using, and how do you see this being applied?
Yeah, I think that first of all, we were California's first B Corp. That was in 2011. It was very intentional that we showed up at the state capitol first thing in the morning, the first day that this option existed legally in the state of California, because we felt that this was a movement that we very much wanted to be a part of. I think that what I really like about the B Corp movement, I love being part of that community. I think that there's, you're associating in that community with business leaders who share the same reason for being. And I think there's something really special about that. I think the ability to support each other is really important. But I also think, and I think you made this point, that the toolkit and the assessment that they use is very comprehensive. And I think one of the things people often think perhaps about Patagonia and the B Corp movement is we're a member of it, or a vocal member of it, and an early member of it, just to be supportive. And I'd like to dispel that belief quickly. I think that being a part of the B Corp community and using the assessment tool every 3 years has made us better. And I think that's validated if you look at our assessment scores, we've improved pretty significantly each time we've done that. And that's a reflection of that tool and that structure asking the right questions and challenging us to think differently than perhaps we would have without it. So I think we're huge believers in that. And I would encourage any business, and again, to sound a little bit pointed, to stop talking about the fact that we can change the system and become a B Corp, do the hard work, figure out how you enter it by scoring an acceptable score and crossing the threshold to enter, but then building on that thereafter. And I think that's one tangible thing that every company can do.
So that's the other thing that you advise the CEO to be doing once that they've done the meditation. You become a B Corp, you've got the playbook, you've got the guidelines, right?
There's really no excuse for not doing it. And I think if you say these things are important, I think this is a very clear commitment that any company can make. It's not without cost and complexity, but I think, anything worthwhile requires that.
What scares you, today when you look at the world, and also like what gives you hope when you look around you and when you look at what's coming and what's at stake?
Yeah, I think on the what scares me part, I think I'm probably no different than anybody that's reading the papers today. I think the health of the planet is, as I mentioned before, it's not just moving in the wrong direction, but it's doing so increasingly quickly. And I really believe that the climate and ecological crisis is an existential threat to humanity. And, I think the only thing that concerns me more than that is the complacency and the disconnect between the beliefs of so many of us and the actions that we take. And I think that whether it's government, business, individuals and their lifestyle decisions, individuals and their opportunity and responsibility to engage through their role as part of civil society, I just don't think there's such a disconnect between what we say is important and what we're willing to do. And that's a huge concern. I think that, my optimism comes from
How do you explain that? How do you explain that disconnect?
I'll tell you a funny story, which is maybe not going to unpack it, but I think it'll make it more tangible, and I'll give it to you in short form. I went to a meeting about 6 months ago here in Amsterdam. It's a business meeting, 25 or so people. Topic was climate change, and everybody that was there from a variety of industries, nobody was there in their business context. They were there as a group of 25 individuals to have a conversation on climate change. And in short form, here's how I'd sum up the discussion. Do you believe in climate change? 100% of the room, yes, absolutely. Do you believe it's man-made? 100% absolutely. Do you believe it's an existential threat? Absolutely. If you have kids, how do you feel about leaving this planet in this condition to your kids? I feel terrible. Then the real question, perhaps the only one that matters, what do we do about it? And almost to a person, the response was, I hope government figures it out. I got a 9:00 meeting, got to roll. And to me, that really highlights this disconnect between what do you believe before and after work and how are you showing up and what are you prioritizing in the variety of roles and the ways that we can influence things. And so to your question, why do I think that there's a disconnect? I just think it's human nature. And I think we have a tendency, whether it's, as I said before, to find the no when there almost certainly is a path towards yes, or it's to feel like we're accomplishing something by saying we care versus taking concrete actions in response to that. And I think to some extent, we're wired that way. And we have really got to shake that up to solve the problem that we've created.
And you were talking about the positive side. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I think I do have a hope and a belief that younger generations are starting to really understand the direction we're headed. And I think they're becoming increasingly demanding and forcing a change. And so whether I'm optimistic or not, I feel just this personal, like non-negotiable responsibility. I've got 2 young kids and they deserve to experience the natural world in the same ways that I've been able to do over my 48 years. And I can't look them in the eyes right now and feel confident or say to them that they'll have that opportunity. And that's something that's really profound. And I think it's, I'm not unique in that regard. And if I didn't have kids, I'd feel exactly the same responsibility to other people's. And so, I think that's the thing that is really grounding. It's the key thing that keeps me really focused. And it is, not my own kids given their very young age, but, kids that are, maybe 5-10 years older, I think they're starting to really understand the mess that we've made and they're starting to hold us to account. And that gives me optimism. That gives me hope.
To finish, do you have 2 books that you recommend to read? And also, I'm curious to know the people or the media that influence you the most.
On books, one that I reread not too long ago, which I'd suggest anyone, if they've read it or not, read it or reread it, is one called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And what I found, it's a beautifully written book and it's well worth anybody's time. But I think what I took away from that book and rereading it is, it's just this stark reminder of how little has changed in our thinking and our behavior in the face of clear scientific evidence about the harm we're doing to ourselves and the natural world. So I just think that is such a foundationally important book. And then a much more recent one is a book called The Soil Will Save Us by an author named Kristen Olson. I think that's a fantastic book for anybody that wants to know more about both what's at risk with our soil, but also the opportunity to use agriculture and the protection of wild places to sequester atmospheric carbon and create healthy topsoil. So I think that's another really, really worthwhile read. And then, I think on people, I don't know that in the media there's anybody I'll point to, but I think that, I feel like when I look around the world, I try to look through the bad news and find the inspiring people and stories. And I think if you're looking for them, they're there. I think over my entire life, I've always really admired people who combine deep thinking with big commitments and action. And, looking backwards in history, the names are familiar from Gandhi to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. I think today it's people like Boyan Slat, who's committed his life to removing plastic from our global oceans, or it's Chris Tompkins and her late husband, Doug, who are 2 individuals with some financial means who moved down to South America and have bought in these small estancias, degraded areas, connected them, built the needed infrastructure to protect huge tracts of land in Chile and Argentina, and then donated them to the governments of Chile and Argentina in creating these lasting national parks and protected areas. I think it includes anyone of any age, any demographic, any sex who's on the front lines of the environmental movement and working to find and scale solutions and making impacts in the ways that they're able to. So those are really the people who inspire me.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. Super inspiring.
Thanks, Julian. I appreciate the opportunity.
None of this is rhetoric, and none of it is hysteria. It is fact.